And while Lucas is just getting going, I want to formally introduce and welcome Professor Manfredi, who's here from the School of Foreign Service. Thank you, Juan, for being here.
All right, excellent. So my name is Lucas. I am a first-year student in the German and European Studies program. And this past school year, I've had an ongoing kind of research project looking at post-industrial regions and their economic transformations. And in the last few months, I've really zeroed in on Pittsburgh and the Ruhr area in Germany, because these two regions are often kind of pointed to as exemplars of successful industrial transitions. This is still an ongoing research project, but I'll show you some of my initial findings. All right, so first things first, I just want to clarify the geography. So when I'm talking about Pittsburgh, I'm actually speaking about the Pittsburgh Metropolitan Statistical Area. So this includes the city, Allegheny County, and the other surrounding counties. The reason I look at the MSA is because historically speaking, kind of the industrial production system of coal and steel started in the city and kind of extended outwards along the rivers. And then the Ruhr region is located in West Germany in the state of North Rhine-Westphalia. It is one of the densest regions of Europe, and it has several major cities such as Dortmund, Bochum, and Essen. So the reason these two cities make for a good comparison is because they have a very, very kind of similar historical industrial economic structure. Germans refer to this as monostructuralism. Basically, this means there was not a diversified economy. So historically speaking, this was coal, steel, and a handful of large employers, right? So in the Ruhr, right, it might be Tyson or Krupp, or now Tyson Krupp, or in Pittsburgh area, like US Steel, right? Here we have a picture of McKeesport, PA. So, right, coal and steel were the kind of common industrial economic structure, but they started to decline in the 1960s and entered crisis in the 1980s. And both economies or regions have kind of undergone a profound shift in the last 30, 40 years towards services. We see this in these two graphs. The left shows Pittsburgh MSA, the right is the Ruhr. The blue line is employment in industry, so right, coal, steel, and then the lines in orange and yellow are the employment in services. And so, right, we see services taking off and industry declining. There are some interesting differences in when and how they declined, but I don't have time for that today. So kind of my research question was, how did local agents and regions kind of navigate this transformation, right? How, as coal and steel were declining, what were the planning decisions made at kind of the local or state level to try to create kind of a modern service economy? And kind of my working thesis is that the Pittsburgh very much relied on more kind of local planning, right? It really emanated from the county and the city and relied very heavily on public-private partnerships, right? From both the city, industry, and later on universities. In the case of the Ruhr, right, we see a much more of a top-down approach. So a lot of the planning and funding was coming from the state, national government, and then later on the EU. And this, I believe, produced different long-term results. So I did a deep dive into both regions and their planning responses. So the years here should be 1945 to 1980. We can kind of group the local responses into two different phases, early and later. These early responses were very much focused on kind of preserving the existing industrial structure. So if we start with Pittsburgh, the plans really began at the regional level. The actors were kind of city and business leaders. And the objective was really to retain large manufacturers with headquarters in the city. There was a fear that these large manufacturers would move their headquarters to the suburbs or other cities. So they formed a local coalition that was really focused on revitalizing the downtown, building new office buildings, parks, cleaning up kind of the smoke and flood protection. Most of it was funded through the private sector, and it was fairly successful. Most of these large manufacturers stayed in Pittsburgh. On the other hand, the Ruhr started its first kind of planning in the late 60s, because this is when coal first began to decline. Planning really came from the state and the national level, and both planned and funded, and it was focused on modernizing existing industry and trying to attract other large manufacturers, such as maybe auto manufacturers, VW. And so a lot of money and subsidies was like delivered to existing manufacturers, kind of incentives for people to move to the region. But there was also a huge investment in infrastructure, especially roads, trains, ports, and key is universities. In the 1980s, we start to see different policy responses. In the 1980s, the coal industry was, or the steel industry was in crisis in both regions. And this was kind of the end of the kind of the industrial era of these two regions. And so we see different policy responses that are more forward looking. So in Pittsburgh, again, the planning begins kind of at a regional level through a coalition of the city, county, and then more actors this time: business, universities being key, Carnegie Mellon and Pitt, unions, and civic groups. And the focus was on developing future high-tech industries, developing culture, tourism, and quality of life, and infrastructure spendings. So we see money going to developing research institutes, trying to kind of take research from the universities and apply them to industry, right? We see a kind of a county-wide sales tax that delivers huge amounts of funds to cultural institutions, stadiums, civic organizations. And the outcomes were mixed. We'll get into that later. In the Ruhr, again, we see something interesting. Planning capacity is actually devolved down to the region for the most part, but the funding is coming from the European Union, which kind of brings supranational priorities and rules about where the funding can go. So it's both supranational and local. The objective is basically the same as the Ruhr, and kind of very, very similar policies, right? Tech transfer stations, Tech Park Dortmund was kind of a big tech incubator. And then IBA Emscher Park was a 10-year initiative to basically turn old factories and industrial areas into parks and museums and sculptures. Yeah. And so the funding here was, again, billions and billions of dollars, right? Because it's coming from the EU. And again, in Pittsburgh, the funding is really just multiples less smaller. We're maybe talking hundreds of millions at the most, coming from the local level and perhaps the state government and some federal block grants. So I was interested in trying to map out the outcomes, and I developed these charts. So this is Pittsburgh first. It's hidden up here, but so this shows all of the different industries in Pittsburgh represented by circles, okay? The larger the circle, the more people working in that industry in the present. Any circle in orange would be an industry categorized as services. Blue would be kind of traditional industry, manufacturing, coal. Yellow would be the public sector, and green is agriculture. The x-axis shows the change in employment from 2008 to 2021. So if it's on the right side, it's a growing industry, or the left side, yeah, this side, it's growing, this side declining. And then finally, the y-axis measures the degree of specialization. So this is something called a location quotient, and it basically measures the percentage of the population working in that industry in the region compared to the US, right? So the higher up on the y-axis, the more specialized that industry is relative to the country. So what do we see in Pittsburgh? Well, first and foremost, basically everything that is growing and is highly specialized is the service sector, right? This is a national trend. What's declining is manufacturing, right? Down here in this corner. And kind of what's interesting about Pittsburgh is it has a high degree of specialization. It has a lot of sectors that are kind of high value added, high tech, that are highly specialized. So for example, and I would argue this is a result of bringing in business and universities into the planning process at the local level. So for example, we see the education sector here. We see arts and entertainment, real focus on developing culture, professional scientific services, finance and insurance, management of companies. This is fracking up here, okay? The picture is a bit different when we shift to the Ruhr. Okay, again, the general trend is the same. Services are growing, manufacturing and industry is declining. But what's different here is that the Ruhr economy is not specialized. I'd argue this is a result of kind of the top-down planning method, right, that did not bring local actors into planning. And so just the region, you know, these industries are growing, which is a good thing, but they are not far above the German average. And the ones that are quite large are not, I would say, particularly high tech or value added. For example, transportation and storage is a large logistics center, right? Think Amazon, trucking, right? Or, you know, health and social work. So the Ruhr is much more of a kind of a mixed picture. It's not bad, but Pittsburgh has done better in this regard. Finally, the area I'm exploring now is the degree to which these planning processes produced social and geographic inclusion and equality, okay? So when we kind of think about Western Pennsylvania and kind of the mill towns outside of Pittsburgh, it's a very bleak picture for the most part, right? This is John Fetterman's Braddock, Pennsylvania, right? A lot of economic dislocation in these communities. So the growth at the center of the region has not kind of spread beyond the urban core and the suburbs. I haven't been to the Ruhr yet, but my sense is that it's a bit more even, kind of geographically speaking, in part because so much more money was just dumped on the region from the EU and the national government. Some of it went to miners who lost their jobs. So this is what I'm investigating now. And while Pittsburgh was perhaps better at producing a highly specialized economy with more kind of value-added sectors, my sense is that the Ruhr was kind of better at promoting kind of social cohesion and equality, which is kind of consistent with larger differences in the American economy and the German economy. Question? Yeah. Great.
Thank you. Wonderful. Eduardo?
Okay. I'm not going to answer questions about this. It's my PowerPoint over there. No, that's not my. Oh, sorry. Here, I thought that. I apologize. My bad. Well, thank you everybody for being here and for your interest in this topic. Unfortunately, some of you are going to have to listen to me once again speak about Buenos Aires. But here we go. And so I'm going to talk about the Buenos Aires Regional Rail Network. And I think that is a very interesting topic, and mostly if we link it to what is a hot topic here in the US, that is rail-based TODs. And I think that is interesting, to be honest, not really because of what experiences can we take from there to here to the US, but mostly because of the differences, maybe not just in the outcomes, but in the baselines. And it's always interesting to compare how different cities or countries are doing, considering their baseline. And so the case of Buenos Aires, it's interesting because first of all, it's the largest metropolitan area in Latin America, measured by area. By population is the third, with 50 million people. It spans over 80 miles wide, and very different. Although the administrative layout or jurisdictional layout is similar to here, the Washington metropolitan area, with a federal district and provinces or states surrounding the central area. There's a huge difference that here there is no MPO. There's no metropolitan planning institution or entity. So every coordination needs to go all the way up to the federal government, which also has to deal with another 23 provinces across the huge geography of the country. But it's also super interesting because, and it makes a great case, because it's a city that was built or developed mostly following the lines of the primitive railroads. As you can see, this is a plan from, I think that late 19th century or early 20th century. The date is behind the other map, so I apologize for that. But this is what Buenos Aires looked like 100 years ago. The dotted red line is the current metropolitan boundaries. So this is 100 years ago. This was only a 1 million people city, almost entirely contained inside the federal district, which is the solid red line. And you can see that there's a whole constellation of small villages and towns populating what is now the metropolitan area, all of them over the rail lines. And so this is primitive TOD, primitive transit-oriented development in some way. And it was really in some way TOD because those small towns were not accidental. There were most of them planned. Like there was a government that 100 years ago laid on a grid, a small grid, 10 blocks by 10 blocks surrounding the stations. And that became what it is today, usually the super dense centers of the satellite jurisdictions of Buenos Aires. After this wonderful development, unfortunately, the rail system started to decay rapidly after it was nationalized in the mid-20th century, until we reached the catastrophic tragedy of 2012 with 52 deaths when one of this train crashed into a train station when it ran out of brakes. So that kind of hit, at that point, the entire rail network, which was mostly built for freight transportation, was only serving the purpose of suburban commuter in the metropolitan area of Buenos Aires. The whole lines that extended way beyond Bolivia or Patagonia are mostly abandoned. And at that point, 20% of commuters into the the federal district were using trains. So when this happened, like there was a huge push in politicians and society to modernize or to change the course of direction of our public transportation. And although it was not about let's do something with our trains, it was more let's build more subways, let's build more freeways, more highways, because trains are something from the past. And there's nothing we can do about this old ancient infrastructure. And people look to cities like Paris, Madrid, London, and they think that we were exactly the same as those cities, with the same financial access and everything. But fortunately, there was a group of people in around 2015 that had an interesting idea. And they say, hey, look at our railway system. We have 500 miles of railroads all across the metropolitan area with only 1.5 million rides per day. That's significantly below standards for this kind of network. And on the other hand, look at who's riding, who's using the railway system. Although 29% of riders are low income, what's very, very concerning is that the riders that are commuting with train and bus, that is to say the ones that are making the longest trip and the further away commute, almost half of them, 46%, are low income. So we have a huge necessity for the most needy people, and we have a huge infrastructure that is not being properly utilized or vacant. What are we going to do? So they came up with this idea that is called today the Regional Rail Network, RER in Spanish. That was a plan that sounded kind of ambitious, but when we look at what it really means, it's really a very effective way of using money to impact a lot of millions of people. Basically, they plan to not just bring to the state of good repair the whole network, which is like a kind of basic thing, but also they propose the construction of 4 elevated viaducts, which are the blue lines crossing the city, and 2 big tunnels across the downtown connecting the railways. This has had 2 big purposes. The first one was increase dramatically the safety of the operation. I myself, I've been 4 times riding one of those trains when the train rolled over somebody in a great cross. I wasn't on the train, and it's not just a horrible situation because of the victims, but it's also from the operational side. You leave a train in the middle of nowhere with probably 1,500 people walking. And so this kind of situation was something regular, and the only way to solve it was eliminate all grade levels. And at some point, it was impossible without building massive viaducts, elevated viaducts. And the tunnels had a different purpose, which was to make incredibly much more efficient the operation of the trains, the commute from edge to edge of the city, which was the one that affected most low-income people. And so this sounds like kind of a dream, but it's actually being built. And the cost was about $15 billion, only a third of it needs funding, the rest is already completed or underway. So this is an example. If you want to go from one end to end of Buenos Aires, Monte Grande and José de Paz are 2 jurisdictions, districts with 300,000 people each. It takes 2 hours. Oh, sorry, you can't see there, but it says 2 hours and a half of commute. You need to take one train to downtown, then another bus all across downtown, and then a second train to the edge of the city. With this construction, you would improve. You will make it possible to take one single train from south to north without any transfer at all. And so when you look at this, yeah, it's a super billionaire project, but the impact was amazing. And the estimates were that it would bring up to 3, it will multiply by 3 or even 4 the ridership from 1.5 million to 5.5 million riders. I apologize for the format. That's some weird thing there. So what's the state of this, and what can we what impact can we see today? The most important thing is that all the underpath and most of the elevated viaducts are already completed. As you see, those pictures are some of the. I think the picture above is the one that is under construction right now. It's almost completed, and the one below is one of the 2 that are already completed. And probably the largest part that is already that still needs to be to move a bit further are the big tunnels, which are under development, and they're probably the bigger undertaking. And so this is how it looks like those places where the viaducts were built. This is Chinatown in Buenos Aires. There's a Chinatown in every big city, and we have one as well. This is not a render. What you see behind the gate, the portal, is the new station, and the green, all those green balconies, and a balcony is the actual railroad. That railroad carries about 200,000 people per day, and you can imagine what did that look like when this train station and the tracks were at level, were at grade, with that street crossing and everything. Ridership in that station multiplied by 3 after this was completed. So that's and the whole neighborhood exploded with activity, shops, restaurants, residents, everything. And so I take it as a very successful case of COD. This is a very significant investment, but it's also had a very huge impact. And the one in the right is one very interesting, because the top right image it's what it looked like maybe 5 years ago. So what they did there is they turned out that elevated highway that is crossing, there's a crossing between 2 avenues and a railway. The elevated highway was demolished and bring into an upgrade level, transform into a boulevard with a BRT. And what was elevated was the railway. So they inverted was a huge construction project. Also, that's the one in the picture in the beginning of my slides. And so what used to be a very hot spot of crime and garbage disposal and everything, now it's parks, BRTs, the entire neighborhood has been redeveloped in a way. And so, and the other case, and the other thing that we will have to look in the future is, I mean, this is the big project, the big tunnels underneath the downtown. Now this looks a lot super futuristic, super ambitious, but this is actually pretty easy to build, because, and I'm going to mention this in a minute, but this is all done underneath an existing avenue. So nobody has to use eminent domain. Nobody has to buy any right away. And so looking at this, I think that these 2 cases are very significant, because it brings up maybe the 2 big questions that we can ask that are very high level, I know, but there are interesting takeaways from this project if we look at it from the American perspective. The first question which we can ask is, what is keeping such a long-range project alive amidst political and economical instability? Some of you know that Argentina is not the most stable country in the world, 100% inflation, political government shifting from far to left all the time, and has one of the worst access to capital markets when it comes to financing these huge projects. And so it's pretty easy to come up with super fancy ideas and magic solutions and never get anything done. So what I think that keeps this project alive is that it achieved intermediate milestones. So the cases that I showed in the past slide, there were just not tiny, but intermediate pieces of the project that allowed the project to show efficient, realistic results to people. And so people now really believe in the project in some way. They know that it's going to get built sometime because they see part of that, and it worked, and they believe in the project, and they support it, which is very difficult because, again, we're a poor country. Where are you going to spend all this money? And so the other big question that we can ask ourselves looking at this project is what makes it achievable and realistic? And probably here's a more urban planning answer or topic. This project, differently than many other super big overhauls or master plans in other big cities, has two or maybe three big enablers. The first one being that the urban layout of the city, Buenos Aires, it was already transit oriented from the beginning. It's not that we have just big avenues, but the big avenues and the big streets were designed in a very transit oriented way for people to walk. It was walkable. It was already designed to host a subway system, which didn't get built as it was planned before. But now you can build this kind of things instead of a subway. And so that makes it a lot easier. Secondly, and this is very significant and interesting for the American practice, that the whole system is under the same entity. There's one single entity that owns the tracks, that owns the operations, that has the planning, and you barely need to use eminent domain to buy any land to this. And that's very important because you have this project links like 6 different rail lines, a bunch of stakeholders. And when you have everything centralized under one single agency, it's probably bad in the beginning because you get what we had, that all the systems started to decay in time. But when you have a very good planning, it can be a great tool for that. Well, just that, I think that is an interesting case to bring up here when we're talking about TODs. And I would just like to make a small mention to Germán Musi. He's the former Secretary of Transportation Planning of Argentina, and he's kind of the father of this project. What you see in the picture is one of the biggest, not the biggest, the second biggest train station in Buenos Aires that was redeveloped, ready, waiting for the tunnel underneath, but already got the station on the existing rail line. And that's it. I appreciate it. I'll take questions after this.
That's great. Thank you. Juan, do you want to step up to the podium? Because then you can get the camera. Yeah. So why don't you step up? Yeah. And as you see, we've moved from kind of big sweeping trends into regionalism and comparative regionalism. Please.
Okay, so thank you very much, Uwe, for the invitation. I have some ideas or questions regarding the two projects. The first one is that congratulations, it's a fantastic presentation and it's very clear to me. This is my first time listening to you about Buenos Aires, so don't worry about it. So we can read it later. So the first issue that I will remark is that it's very important, and I congratulate to you to show where we are. So geography, maps, data is very important. Otherwise, you take for granted that we know Buenos Aires or Pittsburgh, but it's not the average. So, however, I have two questions for each of you. For you, I have sometimes I think that you are very optimistic. I mean, you say something like the outcome is successful. Okay, I want to know why. How do you measure that? So it's not only about change in employment, but what is the value for money? What is the social participation in both cases? What is the social integration? So is people participating? Is people deciding to be in one industry or to switch to another one? Or how do you measure success? Otherwise, this is a very, very interesting lesson for public policies, because sometimes, as you very good explained it, we can decide to preserve current model or modernizing another the economy and the society. In my mind, I hope we can learn from public policies after COVID, after the big cities, maybe it's changing, maybe it's not. What can we learn from that? So that's why I ask you to identify today or in the coming future, what is the success?
Well, happy to answer. When I was defining success or the outcome, I was defining it in terms of kind of the objectives set out by regional or laid out by regional actors at the beginning of kind of their planning. So it wasn't really, I guess, my view, but kind of more in terms of the objectives that they established. But your point is well taken. That
Okay.
you can take
success kind of.
Yeah.
More abstractly.
Yeah, because also sometimes this success is very well defined by the policy planners.
Right.
But when you ask the social
Yeah. Absolutely.
stakeholders, maybe the cost of unemployment was higher than expected. The problems with integration was unexpected, maybe, I don't know. That's my point.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I tried to get at that a little bit by kind of mentioning how Pittsburgh, right, the growth has not really kind of left the city or the suburbs, and they're all kind of left out. There are communities kind of on the outskirts of the city that did not benefit. But yes, I agree. I could focus on that more.
Okay. Anyhow, I congratulate you because this is not so normal. You have a clear research question. Sometimes it's not so, it. So what do you want to know and why, when, which cities, and what time? So congrats. So Eduardo, I have some questions for you also. We can do it in Spanish later. Okay, so I have two questions for you. The first one is about governance. You mentioned very clear that there's only one institution. Is that good? Are you sure about that? How is the governance of that institution working? Who is choosing the board? Who is choosing the plan? How is people participating in that plan? I would like to know something more about that. The second question is, you show a fantastic plan about Buenos Aires, a fantastic map from north to the south and so on. But who is out of that plan? So which neighborhoods or which people is lagging behind this transformation? Sometimes we have to think twice. How many Buenos Aires do we have in a city with 15 million people? Is quite complicated, of course, but this is something maybe we have to consider. So my third question is regarding the elections in October. So I'm sorry.
But that's for appearance. Right?
Yeah, okay. Later. If you're involved, you're fantastic if you want to come. No, I mean, you mentioned very clear that your country sometimes is not so stable. Let's say that. What's going to happen with investments? Who's going to lend the money? How will you access to the capital market? Because you show some data about the cost of the project. What's going on in October? Not who's going to win. Maybe current mayor of Buenos Aires. Who knows? But these are my three questions.
Thank you. Thank you. So the first question about about governance. Well, definitely it's a critical point. I think that as I said, it helps a lot when the institution is running all the structure. But again, that also works when the institution is run by people that not depend necessarily on politics. And so this is actually a hot topic in Argentina, because actually people running institutions actually depend on politics, unfortunately. But that was exactly my point when I came up with one of the conclusions, that intermediate milestones allowed the people to advocate or support or to claim the politician in office to continue with that project. So effectively, actually, as you said, if there weren't any key milestones, if the project had made a lot of progress backstage, like in development or in financing or treaties, or maybe even hiring contractors or even starting the construction, but nothing was delivered of significance in the middle, the project would have died. Because with the change of government, the people running the institutions change again, so nobody would have been claiming that project to move forward. So yeah, I think that is a very good point. And it's also, I think, a very interesting debate. I mean, between extreme, let's put it out, this is not the word, but democratic in some way institutions, or institutions that are absolutely independent on personalities, on people governing, and on the other side, institutions that are almost equal as people running the country. So if they have goodwill, a good plan, and good values, the institution moves forward and the projects move forward. On the other side, you can have stagnation, which is something that sometimes happens a little bit here in the US, in my personal opinion. But it's also the other end is not good. The second question about how far this is reaching, I mean, who's being left apart from this plan? I believe that this is one of probably the most equitable, socially equitable projects in the history of Buenos Aires. The people that live closer to 1 mile from railway station is 2/3 of the entire metropolitan area. 2/3. It's 10 million people. So there was actually one map here where you can see this is the population distribution, and you can see that the rail lines extend almost everywhere where there's people. Maybe a little bit not here and probably not here, but even most of the red area is mostly surrounding rail stations, and they're poor, but they have the rail line. They're not using it because it's not working as it should. And this kind of projects aims to make that rail line a gateway of opportunities for that people. There's another project that we can talk about on a different month. That is a beltway highway, but it's a bad word to speak about highways here. But it's a highway that actually crosses all these surrounding poor areas. And it was a difficult thing when I was in the government to sell to the media that was an equitable, socially equitable project, because it was a highway, but it was a highway that it would allow ambulances, police officers, services to reach out further to these poor neighborhoods. And the third question was about the election. So
Yeah, about investment.
Investment, absolutely. So fortunately, 2/3 of this investment, sorry, I thought I had it, but I don't have it, sorry. Okay, 70% already secure of this cost. That means that it's already built, or it's already secured by Inter-American Development Banks or World Bank credits and other organizations, some Chinese credits around there. But the rest of it, about 5 billion, they should go to the cost of the tunnels. Actually, it's a very good question, and certainly during the former government, the Macri government, who was the one that gave impulse to this project and advocated for this project, the funding from general funds was absolutely secured. I mean, it was a complete priority. We can't say that from the current government, and I'm not sure that we are going to be able to say the same thing for the next government, even when it comes from the same political side, because the economic situation of the country will be much more ruinous than it is today, probably. But definitely, given the huge rate of return of this investment, to put it in a technical way, the advocates of this project are pretty confident that they will find either private or multilateral credit organisms source of funding for this project because of the outcome. Like, it's huge, and it will take several administrations. That's for granted. Still, it is a challenge.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for watching.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's really great. Thanks to both of you. And Lucas, I just wanted to also just make an observation. In the context of comparative regional analysis, you've picked two regions that actually have been in dialogue with each other over the years, which is also fascinating to think about, not only comparing the differences, but also thinking about how knowledge has been shared from one region to another. Yeah. Really interesting. Thanks to both of you. Wonderful job. Okay, we're going to move on now. We've got two more, and then we're going to take a break. We have a little coffee break, and we're going to move into an issue that so many of us are thinking about, talking about, exploring, and that is the nexus between cities and climate change. And Jess, I think you're up first.